I stepped off the number 4 train at Utica Avenue and heard a voice I recognized underneath the rumble of a bus pulling away, thin and shaking, asking a stranger for spare change to buy formula. I turned around. Sitting against the tiled wall of the station, wrapped in a blanket that had gone gray with grime, holding an infant against her chest, was my daughter. She looked up and said 5 words that stopped my heart. "Dad, please don't be mad." My whole world cracked down the middle right there on that platform, and neither of the 2 people responsible for putting her there had any idea what was coming for them. "Thank you for being here. This is Grandpa's reckoning, where family comes first and nobody gets away with hurting the ones we love. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city below, so I know who's sitting with me for this one." A quick note. Some details in this story have been adjusted to protect the people involved, but the message underneath it is real, and I think a lot of you are going to recognize someone in it. I've spent 38 years fixing other people's cars for a living, and in that time I learned something most people never bother to learn. An engine doesn't fail all at once. It fails slow, one worn part at a time, until the day it just stops, and everybody standing around acts surprised, even though the signs were there for months if anyone had bothered to look underneath the hood. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 63 years old, and I own a 2-bay auto shop on Route 9 outside Albany, New York. The same shop my father ran before me, and his father ran before him. I've had grease under my fingernails since I was 12 years old, and I've never in my life turned away a customer whose car needed fixing, even the ones who couldn't pay me that week. I want you to understand the kind of man I am before I tell you what happened, because what I did in the month that followed wasn't rage, it was diagnostics. You don't fix a problem by guessing. You find the failure point, you trace it back to the source, and then you replace what's broken with something that'll actually hold. It was a Thursday evening in October when my whole life rerouted itself in about 4 seconds. I'd driven down to Poughkeepsie that morning to pick up a transmission I'd bought off a salvage yard, and the drive back up the Taconic had been slow, gray, the kind of overcast afternoon where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just sulk. I stopped at the Utica Avenue station because my truck was in the shop getting new brake lines. The mechanic doesn't fix his own brakes when he's exhausted. That's rule 1, and I was catching the train the rest of the way home. I've ridden that line 100 times. I know which platform, which exit, which vending machine eats your dollar, and which one doesn't. I was standing near the turnstiles checking my phone when I heard her. Not loud. That's the detail that's stuck with me since. It wasn't the voice of someone making a scene. It was the voice of someone who'd already asked so many times that she'd stopped expecting anyone to say yes. "Please, I just need enough for formula. My daughter hasn't eaten since this morning, please." I turned toward the sound. Maybe 20 feet away, sitting on a flattened cardboard box against the tile wall, was a young woman with a diaper bag beside her and a baby wrapped tight against her chest. Her coat was a thin denim jacket, nothing built for October in upstate New York. Her sneakers had holes worn clean through at the toes. Her hair was pulled back in a knot that hadn't been redone in days. She wasn't old. That was the second thing I noticed. Her face had the hollow look that comes from weeks of skipping meals, not years. Cheekbones, sharp, dark circles carved under eyes that used to be bright. I know those eyes. I helped bring them into the world. My daughter, Rachel Combs, 26 years old, was sitting on the floor of a subway station, begging strangers for money to feed her baby. My keys hit the concrete before I registered, dropping them. She looked up at the sound and her eyes found mine, and I watched her face do something I hadn't seen since she was 13 and had wrecked her mother's car backing out of the driveway and had to be the one to tell me. Her chin dropped, her mouth opened and nothing came out for a second, and then it did, cracked clean in half. "Dad, Dad, please don't be mad." I didn't know where else to go. I was on the ground next to her before I finished deciding to move, my hand on her shoulder, and I felt bone where there should have been more of her. The baby in the blanket, my granddaughter, 7 months old, a child I hadn't even known existed, was quiet in a way that scared me more than crying would have. Not sleeping, not fussing, just still, her small face pale, her breathing shallow and fast. I want to explain something before I go further, because it matters to everything that happened after. Rachel and I hadn't spoken in 14 months, not because we were fighting, because 18 months ago she'd met a man named Curtis Doyle at a friend's barbecue in Schenectady. and within 4 months, she'd moved into his apartment, and within 6 months my phone calls had started going straight to voicemail, and every time I drove the 40 minutes to check on her, Curtis was the one who answered the door with some story about her being at work, or asleep, or just not up for visitors. I'd called her 31 times over the last 3 months. I'd texted her twice that many. I had believed she'd simply chosen a life that didn't include her father anymore, because a man who has raised a daughter to be independent has to respect it when she stops calling, even when every instinct in his body says something is wrong. I was wrong to respect it. I know that now. Silence from someone you love is not the same as them being fine. I learned that the hardest way a man can learn anything. I unzipped my jacket and wrapped it around the baby, whose name I didn't yet know was Ivy. And I pulled Rachel up by the arm, and her legs shook under her like a jack that hadn't been set right, present but not to be trusted with weight. I didn't ask a single question. There would be time for questions, and I already knew, from the weight of that small body against my chest and the sound my daughter had made when she saw my face, that the answers were going to be the kind that rearrange a man's understanding of everything he thought was true. I flagged down a cab outside the station and gave the driver the address for Albany Medical Center. Not my house, not yet. In the back seat, Rachel's shaking hands were in mine, and my granddaughter was tucked inside my coat against my heart, and I felt something start to form in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was colder than both of those things. Slower. The kind of thing that starts building the moment you realize a problem has been sitting right in front of you for over a year, quietly getting worse, while you told yourself it wasn't your business to interfere. The triage nurse at Albany Med took one look at Ivy and didn't waste time on paperwork. Her name was Deborah Fitch, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with a calm about her that only comes from decades of working in rooms where people are falling apart. She lifted Ivy from my arms, checked her color, pressed 2 fingers to the side of her tiny neck, and called for a warming bassinet without raising her voice. Then she looked at Rachel and said, "You too, come with me." I followed them both through the double doors. They laid Ivy under a heat lamp, wrapped her in a hospital blanket, clipped a small monitor to her foot, and watched the numbers climb. 90, 93, 96. Deborah exhaled. "She's going to be all right," she said. Not to me specifically, but to the room. "She's underweight and dehydrated, showing signs of chronic undernutrition, but she's stable." Chronic undernutrition. Those 2 words landed in my chest like a torque wrench slipping off a stripped bolt sudden, and you know immediately something's been damaged that's going to need real work to set right. Rachel was in the next bay getting an IV line run into her arm, her knuckles cracked, her fingertips a dull purple from cold exposure. I called my wife, Carol, from the waiting area. She answered on the second ring. "Walt, it's almost 7. Where are you?" "I need you at Albany Med," I said. "Emergency entrance. Come now." "Carol." I found Rachel. There was a silence that lasted exactly 2 seconds, and then she said, "I'm getting my keys." She arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing her reading glasses pushed up on her head, her cardigan buttoned wrong, which told me she hadn't stopped to fix it before walking out the door. She saw my face and pressed her palm flat against my chest for a moment. The thing she's done since we were 23 years old. Her own private shorthand for, "I'm here. I understand. We'll handle this." Then she walked straight to Ivy's bassinet and gripped the rail with both hands. Carol didn't cry. Her jaw set hard, and she turned to Deborah and asked, "What does she need?" She came back 2 minutes later with a warmed bottle of formula from the nurse's station and sat down to feed her granddaughter, and she didn't look up again for a long while. Rachel told us everything in pieces, her voice unsteady, stopping and starting like an engine trying to turn over on a cold morning. She told us about meeting Curtis, about how attentive he'd been at first, how he'd remembered small details, how he'd shown up early to everything and called her beautiful in front of people, which felt like being chosen after years of feeling overlooked. She told us he'd convinced her to quit her job at the dental office 9 months ago, right after Ivy was born, so she could, in his words, focus on being a mother without the stress of a boss breathing down her neck. She told us how her phone had been taken 4 months ago, the excuse being that the screen was cracked and needed replacing, and it had simply never come back. "We called you 31 times, I said, keeping my voice level because I needed it level. Her chin dropped. "I know," she whispered. "We drove out to your apartment twice. Both times Curtis answered the door. I watched his face. Both times he said you were resting, that you didn't want visitors right now. He told me you were embarrassed, Dad, she said, her voice cracking on the last word and not recovering. He said you thought less of me for how things had turned out, for quitting my job, for depending on him. I believed him. I believed him because by then I had no phone, no car, no way to check anything without going through him first. The IV line ran clear fluid steady into her arm. I sat in the plastic chair beside her bed and looked at my daughter, 26 years old, a woman who'd put herself through 2 years of community college on her own money, who'd never once needed anyone to take care of her, and I understood, fully, for the first time, the shape of what had been done to her. It hadn't happened all at once. That was the part that mattered. It had happened the way rust happens under a fender you never bother to check, slow and invisible, until the day the metal just gives way under weight it should have held for years. I called my brother-in-law, Frank Delgado, that night, a number I hadn't dialed in almost 10 years, ever since a disagreement over our mother's estate that we'd never fully patched up. Frank had spent 22 years as a family court investigator before retiring to open his own private consulting practice. The kind of man who reads a financial statement the way I read a compression test. Frank, I said, it's Walt. I need your help. And I need you to understand I mean that in the most serious way I've ever said those words to anyone. There was a pause, and then he said, tell me everything. I left the hospital at 6 the next morning. Carol was asleep in the recliner beside Ivy's bassinet, her neck bent at an angle that would cost her 2 days of stiffness. Rachel was out cold in the next bay, Ivy still running. I stood in the doorway looking at what was left of my family scattered around that small room in the gray early light. And then I put on my coat and drove out to the apartment complex in Schenectady where Rachel had been living. The building was a squat brick complex off Altamont Avenue, Unit 14. I'd been there exactly twice in 18 months. Both times turned away at the door. I stood on the front walk and looked up at the second-floor window that had been Rachel's, and I noticed the blinds were different, not the cheap white plastic ones she'd had, but heavier blackout curtains drawn tight even at 7 in the morning. I photographed the building from the street. I was still standing there when a woman came out of the ground floor unit next door in a bathrobe, holding a coffee mug, and stopped when she saw me. You're Rachel's dad, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm Denise. I live right below them. I said yes, and asked if she had a minute. She looked at the building, then back at me, her expression shifting from careful to something more decided. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, she said. I almost called someone a few times. Tell me what you know, I said. She wrapped her robe tighter. About 2 months ago, I stopped seeing Rachel at all. I used to run into her doing laundry, taking the baby for walks. Then nothing. I asked Curtis about her once in the hallway, and he said she'd gone to stay with her mother for a while, needed a break. She paused. But your ex-wife, she doesn't live around here anymore, does she? I told her Rachel's mother had passed 6 years ago. Denise's face went very still. That's what I thought, she said quietly. That's not right at all. She told me she'd seen different men coming and going from the apartment over the past 6 weeks, always in the evenings, always leaving within an hour or two. She told me Curtis had a new truck in the parking lot, a Silverado, brand new, the kind of vehicle that doesn't fit a man who 2 months ago had been driving a 15-year-old Honda with a check engine light that never went off. I thanked her, gave her my number, and asked her not to mention our conversation to anyone. Then I called Frank. I'm outside the apartment, I told him. There's a new truck in the lot, and a neighbor says Rachel hasn't been seen in 6 weeks, and different men have been coming through at odd hours. Frank was quiet for 3 seconds. Walt, he said, I need you to understand what that sounds like, and I need you to not do anything until we know for certain. Come to my office this afternoon. Bring everything Rachel told you last night, word for word if you can remember it. I will, I said. I know you will, he said and hung up. Frank's office was above a bakery in downtown Schenectady. 2 rooms with a window unit that rattled and a whiteboard covered in his handwriting. He was 60 years old, built like a man who'd spent 2 decades hauling case files instead of weights, with the specific stillness of someone who'd learned that getting visibly upset in this line of work costs you more than it ever gives back. I laid out everything Rachel had told us, the job, the phone, the isolation, the men Denise had mentioned, and Frank wrote in silence for a long time before he spoke, Here's what concerns me most, he said. A man who cuts a woman off from her family, takes her phone, isolates her from every support system she has, and then starts bringing other men through the apartment while she's trapped inside with an infant. That's not infidelity, Walt. That's exploitation. And depending on what we find, it could be significantly worse than that. I want you to sit with that for a second, because what we do next needs to be exact. We move once, and we move with everything. Or we don't move at all, and risk tipping him off. He called a contact of his that afternoon, a woman named Priscilla Ahn who did digital forensics work for family law cases, and asked her to pull whatever public footprint existed connected to Curtis Doyle and the apartment. By 6 that evening, she had something. Curtis had posted 3 ads over the past 5 weeks on a website Frank wouldn't say the name of out loud in front of me, describing a private in-home experience with photographs that had clearly been taken inside that apartment, the same second-hand couch Rachel had bought at a consignment shop, the same crooked ceiling fan. The photographs did not show Rachel's face. They didn't need to. Frank had already confirmed the apartment lease was in her name, not Curtis's, which meant every visitor walking through that door was doing so under an address legally tied to my daughter. He'd also been renting the truck through a subprime dealership using a credit application listing Rachel as a co-signer. A signature Frank was fairly confident, based on the shakiness and slant she had never actually provided. That's forgery, Frank said, setting the printout down. Under New York penal law, falsifying a business record with intent to defraud is a felony. Combined with what looks like operating a commercial enterprise without consent, using her residence and her name, and depending on what else we find, we may be looking at trafficking-adjacent charges that involve federal jurisdiction, not just state. I sat very still in that office chair. I thought about the wood, no, the metal. My whole life has been metal. Not wood, but the principle's the same. I thought about what you do when you find corrosion eating through a frame you can't see from the outside. You don't paint over it. You cut it out, all of it, down to clean steel. And you weld in something that'll actually hold, or the whole thing collapses under the next load it carries. 2 nights later, Rachel told us the rest, sitting up in her hospital bed with Ivy asleep in Carol's arms nearby. 4 months ago, she said, Curtis brought a man home, said he was an old army buddy who needed a couch to crash on for a few weeks. His name was Denny. He never left. He didn't work. He didn't help with rent. And about 6 weeks ago, I started noticing men I didn't recognize coming by in the evenings, and Curtis would tell me to take Ivy into the bedroom and stay there until he knocked. I asked him what was going on, and he told me it wasn't my business, that he was handling money for the family, and if I made a scene about it, he'd make sure I never saw Ivy again, because he'd tell everyone I was an unfit mother, unstable, that I'd have no way to prove otherwise, since I had no phone, no job, no car, and no family who'd take my word over his. 3 nights before I found her, she said, Curtis and Denny had gotten into an argument in the kitchen about money, loud enough that Ivy woke up crying, and Curtis had come into the bedroom furious, told her the crying was going to cost him a client, and told her to get out, take the kid, and don't come back until she'd figured out how to keep her quiet. He'd taken $40 from his wallet, thrown it on the bed, and said that was more than enough to get her wherever she needed to go. Denny had driven her to the train station because Curtis didn't want his truck seen anywhere near a woman carrying a baby bag at 11 at night. She'd been sleeping in the station in 2 shelters that turned her away for lack of space for 4 days before I found her. Carol made a sound low in her throat that she turned into a slow breath before it became anything else. I looked at my daughter, 26 years old, and I understood the full architecture of what had been built around her, one small cruelty stacked on another, until the structure was strong enough to trap her completely. There's one more thing, Rachel said, and she reached into the diaper bag beside her bed, the one she'd managed to grab on her way out that night. Down at the bottom, underneath a spare onesie, was a small baby monitor camera, the kind that syncs to an app, battery mostly dead. I kept this in Ivy's room, she said. It's got motion-activated recording. I never had the app on my phone anymore since he took it, but I don't think he ever thought to check what was still saved locally on the card inside. I plugged it into a charger I found at the nurse's station using a cord borrowed from another patient's family, and once it had enough charge to power on, I found the memory card slot and pulled the card, and Frank had a laptop with a reader by the next morning. What was on that card was 11 days of footage, most of it nothing. Ivy sleeping, Rachel changing her, ordinary hours. But on 3 separate nights, the camera had caught men Rachel didn't recognize walking past the cracked bedroom door in the hallway outside. And on one recording, dated 9 days earlier, it caught Curtis's voice clearly through the thin wall, negotiating a price with someone whose voice Rachel didn't know, followed by the unmistakable sound of Denny counting cash out loud. Frank watched all of it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "Under New York law, a recording made on a device owned by someone with an expectation of being in that space is admissible. And this corroborates everything Rachel has told us. Combined with the truck fraud, the unlicensed operation running through a residential address under her name without her knowledge, and what looks very much like coercion to keep her silent and dependent, we have enough to bring in the district attorney's office directly, not just handle this civilly." "Walt," he said, "do not let that memory card out of your sight." I didn't. I put it in a small plastic case and carried it in my shirt pocket, the same pocket where I've kept a folding ruler and a grease pencil since I was 17 years old, for the next 5 days. Frank spent those days building what he called the complete package. Bank records subpoenaed through a court order showing over $11,000 moved through Rachel's name into accounts Curtis controlled, the forged co-signature on the truck loan, the digital footprint of the ads, and the audio and video evidence from the monitor. He brought in a detective from the Schenectady Police Department's Family Crimes Unit, a soft-spoken but sharp-eyed woman named Detective Renata Ferris, who listened to everything without interrupting and then said, "This is enough for an arrest warrant on trafficking and endangerment charges alone, and we'll add fraud and forgery on top of it. But I want to do this cleanly. I want him in one place, unaware, so there's no chance to destroy evidence or run." That's when Frank found out about the party. Denise, the downstairs neighbor, called me on the 6th day and said Curtis had been telling people at the building he was throwing a celebration that Saturday night at a banquet hall out on Balltown Road, something about closing on a new business venture, catering brought in, a real production. He'd need something to celebrate publicly, Frank said when I told him. If he's about to expand whatever this operation is, a public event gives him witnesses to his version of respectability. It also gives us a room full of people, cameras on their phones, and nowhere for him to disappear to. I found the owner of the banquet hall myself 2 days before the party, a man named Ray Dela Cruz, who ran the place with his wife, and had known my father back when Combs Auto did the timing belt on every delivery van Ray's family restaurant used to own. I told him everything. No embellishment. Laid it out the way I'd write up a repair estimate, item by item. Then I played him 30 seconds of the audio from the monitor. Ray stood in his own dining room and listened to a man negotiate access to a young mother trapped in her own apartment. And when it ended, he didn't say a word for a long moment. "I've got 2 daughters, he finally said. "What do you need from me?" I told him. "Access through the side kitchen entrance, no interference from staff, and quiet until we walked in the front." "You've got it," he said, and shook my hand. Rachel and Ivy came home to more decency in this room today than that whole family's seen in months. We arrived Saturday at 4:40, 20 minutes before Curtis had told the hall to expect his guests. Detective Ferris came with 2 uniformed officers who waited outside, out of sight, ready to move, once we'd confirmed his location inside. Frank had his documentation in a leather folder. Carol stood with her coat buttoned, her hands steady, the same look on her face she'd worn the whole week, decided, and simply waiting for the right moment. Rachel stood beside me holding Ivy, who was heavier now than she'd been 8 days earlier, color back in her cheeks, and I looked at my daughter and said, "You don't have to say a word in there unless you want to. Just being seen is enough." She nodded, her jaw set the exact way it used to set when she was small and determined to finish something on her own. Through the small window in the kitchen door, I could see the banquet room round tables, string lights, a hired photographer setting up a backdrop with balloons that spelled out a phrase I won't repeat because it makes my stomach turn, even now. Something about new beginnings. Curtis was at the center of the room in a suit that didn't fit him quite right, laughing with a group of people who were listening like he'd said something important. Denny sat near the bar, eating from a tray of appetizers, scrolling his phone. I recognized 2 faces in that crowd. One, was a woman from Rachel's old dental office, who must have been invited under some pretense, and one was a young man I later learned had responded to one of Curtis's ads and had been invited, unknowingly, into a room where the truth was about to catch up with everyone. We walked in together, and the room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way a shop floor goes quiet when someone kills the compressor mid-shift, the hum dying out table by table until the only sound left was a playlist nobody had thought to turn off. Curtis turned. I watched the exact moment he understood who was standing in his doorway, first confusion, then recognition, then something in his face that dropped like a transmission losing a gear. His eyes went past me to Rachel, holding Ivy, and for 1 second something like fear crossed his face before it hardened back into something uglier. Denny saw us 2 seconds later and was on his feet immediately, his eyes cutting toward the side exit. Detective Ferris, standing just behind Frank in plain clothes, said clearly, "Everyone stay exactly where you are," and held up her badge. "Curtis," I said, and my voice didn't need to be loud. The room was that quiet. "This is my daughter Rachel. This is my granddaughter Ivy. I think some of you were told a story about where they've been for the last 2 months. It isn't true." Rachel didn't wait for me to say more. She'd been holding something in for 8 days, carefully, and this was the moment to set it down. "My name is Rachel Combs," she said, her voice steadier than I'd heard it since the hospital. "This is my apartment lease. This is my name on a truck loan I never signed for. And this is a recording from inside my own daughter's nursery." She looked at Curtis. "You told everyone I left because I was unstable. You want to explain to this room what you were actually doing while I was locked out of my own life." A woman near the back stood halfway up from her chair, her hand at her mouth. The young man who'd responded to one of Curtis's ads looked from Curtis to Rachel and back, his face going through several stages of understanding at once, landing somewhere close to disgust, mostly at himself. Frank stepped forward and opened his folder. "My name is Frank Delgado," he said. "I'm a licensed investigator, and what I'm about to describe is documented, corroborated, and already in the hands of the Schenectady Police Department's Family Crimes Unit." He read the charges out loud, evenly, without theater, because precision was the whole point. Forgery, in the financial application, unlawful operation of a business enterprise under a residential lease held by someone without knowledge or consent, endangering the welfare of a child, and coercion consistent with trafficking statutes under both state and federal law. Denny made a break for the side door the moment the word trafficking left Frank's mouth, and the 2 uniformed officers who'd been staged outside had him on the ground in the parking lot within 10 seconds, his face pressed into the gravel, Detective Ferris reading him his rights before he'd finished cursing. Curtis didn't run. He stood frozen in the middle of that banquet room full of people who'd shown up believing they were celebrating something, and I watched every version of denial pass across his face before he settled on the one he must have thought would work best. "Walt," he started. "This isn't what it looks." I raised one hand. "Don't," I said quietly. "Just stand there and let these people look at what's actually in front of them." Detective Ferris cuffed him at 5:14 that evening in front of 31 witnesses, several of whom had their phones out recording before she'd even finished the sentence about his right to remain silent. Frank stayed behind to give a statement while Carol and I took Rachel and Ivy home, back to the house Rachel had grown up in. The same bedroom she'd had at 16, still painted the pale green she'd picked out herself. Curtis Doyle was formally charged 11 days later with forgery, fraud, endangering the welfare of a child, and 2 counts related to the operation he and Denny had been running, which once investigators pulled full records turned out to have exploited at least one other young woman in a nearby county under nearly identical circumstances, a discovery that opened a wider investigation Frank still consults on to this day. Denny took a plea deal and testified against Curtis in exchange for a reduced sentence. Curtis did not take a deal. At trial the following spring, he was convicted on all counts and is currently serving a sentence upstate that will keep him there for a considerable number of years, long enough that Ivy will be well into grade school before there's any question of him walking free again. The truck was repossessed within the month once the fraudulent loan was formally voided by the court. The debt cleared from Rachel's name entirely, a process Frank walked her through personally so she'd never have to face a collections call about it again. The apartment lease was terminated, and the landlord, once he understood what had actually happened, waived every dollar of the remaining balance rather than pursue Rachel for it. I drove past that building only once after everything settled, on my way to a parts supplier out that direction, and I didn't slow down. Some places don't need a second look to know they're finished mattering to you. Rachel didn't go back to the dental office right away. She spent the first 2 months mostly on the couch with Ivy, sleeping in real stretches for the first time in nearly a year, eating meals Carol put in front of her without asking if she was hungry, because Carol has never, in 39 years of marriage, waited for a yes before feeding someone who needed feeding. I didn't push her toward anything. Some engines need to sit a while before you turn the key again, and forcing it too soon just floods things worse. The first Saturday Rachel walked out to my shop, she didn't touch a single tool. She stood in the doorway with Ivy on her hip and looked around the way you look at a place you used to know well and are checking against your memory. The shop smelled the way it always has, motor oil and rubber, and the specific dry heat of a space bay heater that's been running the same way for 30 years. You don't have to do anything, I told her, from under the hood of a Camry I was timing for a regular customer. You can just be here. She came in and sat on the stool by the parts counter and watched me work, Ivy on her lap, chewing on a set of plastic keys. She came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. On the fourth Saturday, 6 weeks after the banquet hall, she set Ivy down in the playpen Carol had bought and set up in the corner office, walked over to the second bay, and picked up a socket wrench off the pegboard, the same pegboard she used to help me organize as a girl, color-coding sizes with stickers I still haven't had the heart to peel off. She didn't say anything. She selected a car battery that needed testing and got to work. And I kept my eyes on my own job and listened to the small, familiar sounds of someone competent getting reacquainted with, using their hands for something that mattered. Frank called on a Tuesday in early December. The other woman Curtis and Denny had exploited, he said, had come forward fully once she saw the news coverage of the arrest, and her testimony had strengthened the case considerably. "It does Rachel know?" I asked. "I called her myself," he said. She said thank you, and then asked whether the court fees from voiding the truck loan had all been settled. I held the phone for a second. "That sounds like my daughter," I said. "It does," Frank said, and we both let that sit for a moment before he hung up. Winter came the way it does in the Hudson Valley, without much warning. One morning the trees bare, and the next, the first real snow, sitting heavy on the shop roof. Ivy turned 1 in January, and we had a small gathering in the kitchen, just Carol, Rachel, myself, and Frank and his wife, who'd become something closer to family again over the past 2 months than they'd been in the 10 years before it. Ivy smashed a fistful of cake into her own hair with the total confidence of someone who has no idea yet what she survived, and I think that's exactly how it should be. Some weight isn't meant to be carried by the people small enough to have been carried by it instead. By the time spring came around, Rachel had gone back to work 3 days a week at a different dental practice closer to our house, and Ivy spent those days with Carol, who has strong and specific opinions about how a toddler should be fed that mostly involve more vegetables than Ivy would prefer. On Saturdays, Rachel still comes to the shop. Last week she finished rebuilding a carburetor entirely on her own, from disassembly to reinstall, and held it up to the shop light the way I taught her to check a part, turning it slow, looking for anything still off before calling a job done. "It's clean," she said. "It is," I agreed. She set it down on the bench and looked around the shop, the lift, the tire rack, the pegboard with her old stickers still faintly visible under 13 years of grime, and said, "You think there's room for a second lift bay back here eventually?" I looked at the back wall, measuring it the way I measure everything. Not guessing, but actually accounting for clearance and workflow. "There's room," I told her. She nodded, already turning the idea over, already picturing it. The same look she used to get at 9 years old, deciding she wanted to learn how an engine actually worked, instead of just riding in the passenger seat. She'd always had good hands for this work. She just needed someone to hold the door open until she found her way back to using them. I'm 63 years old, and I spent over a year believing that respecting my daughter's silence was the same thing as respecting her choices. It wasn't. Silence isn't always a choice a person is free to make. Sometimes it's the only thing left after everything else has been taken from them. And it is our job as fathers, as parents, as the people who love them first, to notice the difference before it costs something we can't get back. I believe certain moments get placed in a man's path not to punish him, but to show him exactly what he still has time to fix. That evening on the platform at Utica Avenue wasn't bad luck. It was the moment I was supposed to be there, and I thank God every single day that I didn't miss it. If this story reached you tonight, if it reminded you of your own daughter, your own son, a door in your family that's gone quiet and needs someone to knock on it again, tell me in the comments below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because every story on this channel is built for families like yours, and every comment you leave helps us reach the parents and grandparents who need it most. Thank you, sincerely, for staying with me until the very end tonight.